Hey guys, it's Mrs. Gebhardt, and today I'm going to talk to you about how to determine the validity of a source or text evaluation. Especially nowadays, I think this is a really important skill, as we've seen even with recent events where, with social media and such, anybody can post anything they want to on the internet. And what is true and what is not is often quite obscured or blurred at times. So this standard that we're going to be assessing is not only valuable when trying to figure out what sources are credible for something like a research paper, but also just how you should approach different things that you read or see in print or online in your everyday lives. So we're going to look at this acronym SWAB, S-W-A-B, and it is an easy way to remember some basic things to look for when you are trying to see whether a source is credible or valid. You might have learned this in middle school, I'm not sure, but I'm going to stay consistent with it. And it is a good starting point and an easy way to address this particular standard. So the first part of SWAB is source. That's the S. So that's just looking at where it comes from. So if it's an article, you want to look at the source of the article. Who is backing it? Where was it first published? Does this source have a credible reputation? When was it written? Is it current? What is the purpose of this source and or article? So all of those things come into play with source. Obviously where it was first published, because a lot of things, especially on the internet, are republished with permission. So going back to that original place is always good, but also where you find it can come into play too. Something that comes from the New York Times might have a little bit more credibility than something that comes from somebody's high school newspaper and things like that. Also, when it talks about having a credible reputation, there are sources that have credible reputations but also have bias. So, if you look at something like Comedy Central and The Daily Show, they might have a credible reputation, but they also are known for being biased towards the liberal side versus Fox News, which would be towards a conservative side. So that's something that you want to take into consideration too. Obviously, when it was written, there definitely are things, even with like a media literacy unit that I did, there was a quiz from many years ago, and when I went through it, a lot of those questions weren't applicable anymore because those rules had changed. So it's not that something that's not current isn't credible, but you have to think about those things and evaluate that as you go through. The next one, the W in SWAB, is for word choice. Basically, you're looking at what the connotations of the words are. Is the text loaded in any way? Are the words geared toward a particular audience? Do the words create a certain tone? So this is where you can use that tone standard to help you with this, right? If you have words that are either create an angry tone or a sad tone or trying to evoke some sort of an emotion out of the reader, that's something that's going to be important in thinking about the credibility. Also, the level of vocabulary is probably something that can come into play with word choice too, whether somebody uses academic or standard vocabulary. If somebody uses slang, depending on what you're using the source for, that could come into question with the credibility. It's all looking at it for the purpose of use and what you're trying to gain from it. That's what you have to remember the whole time throughout this. And the A in SWAB is for author. When you're looking at author, obviously, if there's not an author given, that can happen sometimes, and that's not one that you can't obviously evaluate that then. But if it does have an author, you want to think about what are the author's credentials? Are they given? If not, can you Google the author and find information? I do that a lot. So if it just gives an author, sometimes if you're on a website, you can click on the author's name and it gives a brief bio or it gives some credentials there. Sometimes not. But like I said, I always recommend trying to get some background information on the author. That also helps you if you're trying to incorporate this into your research, because when you're leading into using something from an author, if you can give a little bit of credential background with that author, that strengthens your research and strengthens your credibility. And does the author have experience with the topic? There's been articles I've read where there was a very published author who had many articles in different magazines, but they were all geared towards finance. And then this was a particular article on like baking or something like that, which maybe the person does have experience with baking, but I couldn't find anything in the credentials. So probably the finance articles with the BA in science and things like that would have been something that I could latch onto more. The baking article, I don't know if she has as much credibility, and that's kind of how you want to look at that too. Also, what is the author's educational background? Again, by Googling that or usually clicking on a bio, that can give you that information as well, and that comes into play. Does the author show bias towards a topic? That kind of overlaps with the word choice, but they kind of come together there. Balance of information is the last component of SWAB, and that basically just means how much is fact and how much is opinion. If an article is straight up opinion and doesn't have any facts or examples to support, it's hard to give it a ton of credibility. Even if the person is an expert, you got to have some details to support it. Is there enough information to back up claims? Does the person just make these claims without adding any detail behind it? For this, what I like to do is if I have an article or print it out, I use 2 different color highlighters and highlight what is fact and what is opinion. Now, just because an article has opinion doesn't mean that it's not valid or credible or usable in research, or that you shouldn't believe what it's saying. But you want to have, I'd say, a good balance of facts to support it based off of the purpose of the article. Editorials will be opinionated, but they'll have facts to back up if they're good. So you need to look for that. And I would say at least 40 to 50% of facts or examples or details versus the opinion statements. Some other things to consider are the spelling and grammar. If there are spelling and grammar errors, that can hurt the credibility of a piece. Also, if the author uses logical fallacies, which we haven't talked about yet, but we will later on in this unit, the argument becomes weak. Basically, that means when they say something or they draw a conclusion that really doesn't make sense. And so that's an error in logic. Other things to consider: what is the author's purpose? If it's to persuade, there will be more bias. To inform is usually going to have more information. And then to entertain, it might not be grounded in evidence. So you might be careful with how you would use articles that are written more to entertain. Another thing to look at is how the author organizes his or her thoughts, and is the organization effective. If it's sort of all over the place, that can lower a credibility score. It should be very clear. You should be able to follow everything logically. You can look at text features that organizes information, headings and subheadings. That's a good clue that the author is taking this seriously and having an effective introduction and conclusion. And then this is the last thing I sort of wanted to say. Now, just because a source is not the most credible does not mean you need to throw it out or disregard it. As long as you realize and recognize the shortcomings, it still could contain valuable and useful information. Some for research, some not. I mean, the whole point of this is trying to say, what information can I use and what would work? Also, when you're looking at things that you're reading just for your own personal knowledge, I read things that are very biased and opinionated on both sides in different directions because I want to be an educated and informed person. But do I take everything that is said in those as fact? No. As long as I'm recognizing those shortcomings, then it can be valuable to me. So to sum up, the 4 things that we're really going to be looking for when we look at text evaluation is SWAB: source, word choice, author, and balance of information. You can consider other things as well, like I mentioned, and I'm going to be asking you to evaluate your sources that you use for any of your research, and then also just other sources that we read for informational purposes. So, thanks a lot, guys.